Rotero completo. Jean Piaget. You ever catch yourself in a conversation where someone completely misunderstands what you just said? Not because they weren't listening, but because they literally cannot process the concept the way you do? Or maybe you've watched a child struggle with an idea that seems obvious to you and you wonder why they just don't get it. Perhaps you've experienced that frustrating moment when you try to explain something important to someone, using what seems like perfectly clear logic, and they look at you like you're speaking another language entirely. That disconnect, that wall between minds, isn't about intelligence or attention. It's about something far more fundamental that's been shaping how you think, learn, and understand the world since the moment you were born, and you've been completely unaware of it happening. This invisible force has been orchestrating every leap in understanding you've ever made, every breakthrough in comprehension, every moment when something suddenly clicked that never made sense before. It's been there when you learned to read, when you grasped abstract concepts for the first time, when you developed the ability to imagine scenarios that don't exist yet. And here's what makes this revelation even more unsettling. You're not done with this process. Right now, in this moment, your mind is still moving through developmental phases that determine what you can understand, how you solve problems, and even how you perceive reality itself. Most people live their entire lives never realizing they've been climbing an invisible ladder of cognitive development, and that where they are on this ladder literally shapes what's possible for them to comprehend. Jean Piaget, the Swiss psychologist who spent over 6 decades studying how human intelligence develops, made a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about the human mind. His revelation wasn't that children are simply smaller, less experienced adults who need to learn more facts. It was something far more profound and, frankly, more humbling. He discovered that the human mind doesn't just accumulate information like a hard drive filling up with files. Instead, it transforms through distinct, predictable phases where the actual structure of thinking fundamentally changes. The way a 4-year-old processes information isn't just less sophisticated than an adult's thinking. It's categorically different, operating on an entirely separate architecture of logic. And this isn't a flaw or a limitation to overcome quickly. It's an essential journey that every single human being must travel through, stage by stage, with no shortcuts available. The implications of Piaget's work are staggering when you really sit with them. Every frustration you've ever felt trying to teach someone something, every moment of confusion when someone couldn't grasp what seemed obvious to you, every time you've looked back at your younger self and cringed at decisions that made perfect sense at the time, all of it traces back to these 5 phases of mental development. Today I'm going to walk you through each of these phases, not as abstract psychological theory, but as the actual lived experience you've been through without recognizing it. I'm going to show you how these stages shaped your entire cognitive reality, how they're still affecting the people around you in ways that create daily misunderstandings, and why understanding this framework will fundamentally change how you interact with every person in your life, from your children to your colleagues to yourself. The story begins in 1920s Switzerland, in a psychology laboratory that smelled of old books and chalk dust, where a young Jean Piaget sat observing something that would occupy his attention for the next 60 years. He was watching children take intelligence tests developed by Alfred Binet, the French psychologist. And while everyone else focused on whether the children got the answers right or wrong, Piaget became fascinated by something entirely different. He noticed that children of similar ages made the same types of mistakes, errors that followed consistent patterns. A 5-year-old's wrong answer wasn't random or careless. It was systematically wrong in a way that revealed an underlying logic, a logic that was internally consistent but fundamentally different from adult reasoning. Piaget began conducting experiments that would become legendary in psychology. In one of his most famous studies, he would show children 2 identical glasses of water filled to the same level. The children would agree the glasses contained the same amount. Then, right in front of them, Piaget would pour the water from one glass into a taller, thinner glass. The water level rose higher in the new glass because of its shape. Then he would ask the critical question, do these glasses still have the same amount of water? Children under a certain age would consistently say no. The tall glass now has more water because the level is higher. Even though they had just watched the water being poured, seeing with their own eyes that nothing was added or removed. They couldn't grasp that the quantity remained constant. Older children would immediately recognize the amounts were still equal, often looking confused about why anyone would even ask such an obvious question. This wasn't about memory or attention. These children weren't forgetting what they had seen moments before. They were interpreting the same reality through an entirely different cognitive structure. Their minds hadn't yet developed the concept of conservation, the understanding that certain properties remain stable even when appearance changes. And here's what made Piaget's insight revolutionary. He realized this wasn't a gap in knowledge that could be filled by simply explaining the concept. No amount of teaching could rush a child through this cognitive barrier. Their minds had to develop the underlying mental structures first, through interaction with the world, through hands-on experience manipulating objects and testing theories about how reality works. The architecture of thought itself had to evolve before certain types of understanding became possible. Piaget documented 5 distinct phases that every human mind moves through as it develops from birth to adulthood. These aren't arbitrary categories he imposed on human development. They're descriptions of genuinely different ways of organizing and processing information about reality. Let me walk you through each phase, and as I do, I want you to think about the people in your life, because you'll start recognizing these phases playing out in real time around you every single day. The first phase begins the moment you're born and extends through your first 2 years of life. Piaget called this the sensory-motor stage. And during these 24 months, your entire understanding of reality is built through physical sensation and motor action. There's no internal mental representation happening yet. When an object leaves your field of vision, it ceases to exist in your mental world entirely. This is why peekaboo is so thrilling for infants. When your face disappears behind your hands, you have actually vanished from their reality. When you reappear, you have literally returned to existence. It's not a game of hiding. It's genuine disappearance and reappearance in their cognitive universe. During this phase, babies are conducting countless experiments on physical reality every waking moment. When your infant drops a spoon from their high chair for the 40th time and you pick it up, they're not trying to annoy you. They're testing gravity, investigating object permanence, exploring cause and effect. Each drop is a hypothesis being tested. Does the spoon still fall down? Does it make the same sound? Does the adult retrieve it? What happens if I change the angle? These aren't conscious questions, obviously, but they represent genuine scientific inquiry happening at a pre-verbal level. By the end of this phase, around age 2, children have constructed a basic understanding that objects continue to exist even when out of sight, that actions have consequences, and that they are separate beings from the objects and people around them. The second phase emerges between roughly ages 2 and 7, and Piaget called this the pre-operational stage. This is where symbolic thinking begins, where language explodes, where imagination becomes possible. Children in this phase can now mentally represent objects and events. They can play pretend, using a banana as a telephone or a box as a spaceship. They can use words to represent things that aren't physically present. This is a massive cognitive leap from the sensory-motor phase. But here's the fascinating constraint. Their thinking is still deeply egocentric, not in the sense of being selfish, but in the literal sense that they cannot yet mentally separate their own perspective from others' perspectives. Piaget demonstrated this with his famous 3 mountains task. He would show a child a model of 3 mountains of different heights with different features on each. He'd place a small doll on the opposite side of the model from where the child sat. Then he'd show the child several photographs taken from different angles around the mountains and ask which photo shows what the doll sees from its position. Children in the pre-operational stage consistently chose the photo matching their own view, not the doll's view. They literally couldn't mentally rotate the perspective to imagine what the scene looks like from a different vantage point. Their own perspective dominated so completely that other perspectives weren't just difficult to access, they were essentially invisible to their cognitive system. This phase also features magical thinking, where cause and effect relationships don't follow logical necessity. A child might believe their angry thoughts cause their parent to get sick, or that wearing their lucky shirt makes them run faster. Reality, imagination, and causation blend together in ways that seem nonsensical to adults, but follow a perfect internal logic within the preoperational mind. Children in this stage can't yet perform what Piaget called mental operations, the ability to mentally reverse actions or consider multiple dimensions of a problem simultaneously. Remember that water conservation experiment? That's a classic test separating preoperational from the next phase. Look, I need to pause here for just a moment, because I think what we're talking about touches something really important. You've probably experienced that feeling where you're trying to explain something to someone, maybe a child, maybe even another adult, and it's like your words just can't land. Like there's this invisible barrier preventing the concept from taking hold, no matter how clearly you explain it. Have you ever felt that frustration where you know you're making sense, you know your logic is sound, but the other person just cannot seem to grasp what you're saying and you start wondering if it's you, if maybe you're the problem, if you're explaining it wrong? If this resonates with you, leave a comment right now with this simple phrase: I thought it was me. Your experience might be exactly what someone else scrolling through these comments needs to read today, to feel less alone in that confusion. You have more power to validate and heal than you realize, just by sharing that you've been there too. Now, the third phase typically begins around age 7 and extends to about 11 or 12. Piaget called this the concrete operational stage, and it represents another fundamental transformation in cognitive structure. Children entering this phase suddenly gain the ability to perform mental operations, but only on concrete, tangible objects and events they can directly perceive or manipulate. They can now understand conservation, that the water poured into a different shaped glass remains the same amount. They can mentally reverse actions, imagining the water being poured back into the original glass. They can classify objects into hierarchical categories and understand that something can belong to multiple categories simultaneously. A golden retriever is a dog, but it's also a mammal, and it's also an animal, and all these classifications can be true at once. This is when logical thinking begins, but it's tethered to concrete reality. A child in this stage can solve problems involving real objects and observable events, but they struggle with purely hypothetical or abstract concepts. If you ask them to solve a concrete problem, they'll excel. If you present the exact same logical structure as a purely abstract puzzle with no connection to tangible reality, they'll struggle. Their thinking has gained incredible power compared to the previous phase, but it's still anchored to what they can see, touch, and directly experience. They can organize the visible world with impressive logic, but they can't yet systematically think about thinking itself, or reason about possibilities that don't currently exist. Here's where Piaget's observations get really interesting for understanding adults, not just children. He noticed that many people's cognitive development slows down, or even stalls at this concrete operational stage. They can navigate daily practical problems brilliantly. They can manage complex logistics, learn procedures, follow intricate step-by-step processes. But ask them to engage with purely abstract concepts, to reason about hypothetical scenarios that require holding multiple variables in mind simultaneously, to think about theoretical frameworks disconnected from immediate concrete experience, and you'll see the limitations emerge. This isn't a character flaw or a learning disability. It's simply that their cognitive development reached this phase and stabilized there, never fully transitioning into what Piaget identified as the final phase. The fourth phase, which Piaget called the formal operational stage, typically emerges around age 11 or 12 and continues developing through adolescence and into early adulthood, though many researchers now believe it continues evolving well into the 20s. This is where abstract reasoning becomes possible, where you can think systematically about ideas disconnected from concrete reality. Suddenly, hypothetical thinking becomes natural. You can imagine scenarios that don't exist and reason through their implications. You can consider multiple variables simultaneously and systematically test hypotheses. You can think about your own thinking, analyzing your thought processes as objects of contemplation themselves. Adolescents entering this stage become capable of considering abstract moral principles disconnected from specific situations. They can debate justice, fairness, truth, not just as concrete rules for specific circumstances, but as philosophical concepts applicable across countless scenarios. They become capable of scientific reasoning, forming hypotheses, designing tests, considering control variables, drawing conclusions from patterns in data. They can understand metaphor and allegory at deeper levels because they can hold the literal and symbolic meaning simultaneously. Literature, philosophy, advanced mathematics, theoretical physics, all of these become accessible because the mind can now operate on abstractions as fluently as it previously operated on concrete objects. But here's what's crucial to understand, and this is where Piaget's work becomes deeply relevant to your daily life right now. Not everyone fully develops formal operational thinking, and even those who do don't apply it consistently across all domains. Research following Piaget's initial work has shown that formal operational reasoning is actually less universal than the earlier stages. Some estimates suggest only about 30 to 35% of adults consistently use formal operational thinking across various contexts. Many adults remain primarily concrete operational thinkers, and they navigate the world perfectly well within that framework. They might use formal operational thinking in their areas of expertise, where they've developed deep familiarity, but default to concrete thinking in unfamiliar domains. This explains so much of the communication breakdown you experience daily. When you're frustrated that a colleague can't seem to grasp a strategic concept that seems obvious to you, there's a good chance they're processing the information through concrete operational structures while you're using formal operational reasoning. When a family member keeps focusing on specific examples instead of engaging with the general principle you're trying to discuss, they're not being stubborn or difficult. They're literally thinking through a different cognitive structure. When someone asks for step-by-step instructions instead of understanding the underlying logic that would let them adapt flexibly, they're revealing the cognitive phase they're operating from. And here's what makes this even more complex. Context matters enormously. You might use sophisticated, formal operational thinking in your professional domain, where you've built years of experience, but drop back to concrete operational thinking when facing a completely unfamiliar field. The cognitive structures you have available aren't fixed across all situations. They're tools you deploy based on familiarity, stress level, cognitive load, and emotional state. Piaget also identified what he called horizontal décalage, a fancy term for the observation that cognitive abilities don't emerge uniformly across all types of problems simultaneously. A child might successfully demonstrate conservation with liquid, but still fail conservation tasks involving mass or number, even though they all require the same underlying logical operation. The cognitive structure develops unevenly, succeeding first in domains where the child has more experience or where the perceptual cues are less misleading. This pattern continues into adulthood. You might reason at a formal operational level in familiar contexts, but regress to earlier thinking patterns under stress or in unfamiliar territory. Now, there's actually a fifth element to Piaget's framework that's often overlooked but incredibly important for understanding complete cognitive development. Recent research building on Piaget's foundation has identified what some call the post-formal operational stage, emerging in adulthood. This represents another transformation where thinking becomes more dialectical, able to hold contradictions and paradoxes without needing immediate resolution. Adults at this phase become comfortable with ambiguity, recognizing that many problems don't have single correct answers. They develop what's called relativistic thinking, understanding that truth can be context-dependent, that multiple perspectives can each hold validity, that wisdom often involves accepting complexity rather than reducing it to simple rules. This post-formal thinking integrates logic with emotion and intuition. It recognizes that purely rational analysis has limits, that subjective experience matters, that some knowledge is tacit and embodied rather than explicit and verbal. People thinking at this level become skilled at what psychologists call dialectical reasoning, the ability to see how apparent opposites might both be true, how thesis and antithesis can produce synthesis. They move beyond either or thinking into both and thinking. They become comfortable saying I don't know and sitting with uncertainty rather than rushing to premature closure. Consider the real-world implications of these developmental phases playing out around you constantly. When parents become frustrated that their 8-year-old can't seem to think ahead and anticipate consequences, They're often expecting formal operational thinking from a child still in the concrete operational phase. When teachers design lessons that assume students can engage with abstract concepts before their minds have developed the structures to support that thinking, learning becomes unnecessarily difficult and frustrating for everyone involved. When workplace training programs present purely theoretical frameworks to employees who process information primarily through concrete operations, the training fails not because people aren't trying, but because there's a mismatch between cognitive structure and information format. The most successful educators, parents, managers, and communicators are those who've learned to recognize what cognitive phase someone is operating from and match their communication style accordingly. They know when to use concrete examples instead of abstract principles. They know when someone needs hands-on experience before verbal explanation will make sense. They know that you can't rush cognitive development by simply explaining harder or repeating louder. The mind develops its structures through active engagement with problems at the edge of current capability, through what Piaget called assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is when you encounter new information and fit it into your existing mental structures, like adding new facts to categories you already have. Accommodation is when new information doesn't fit your existing structures, forcing you to fundamentally reorganize how you categorize and understand things. Both processes are essential for cognitive growth. Too much assimilation with no accommodation leads to rigid thinking, unable to adapt to genuinely new situations. Too much accommodation with no assimilation leads to cognitive chaos, constantly restructuring with no stable foundation. Development happens through the dynamic balance between these two processes, gradually building more sophisticated and flexible mental structures. Throughout his 6 decades of research, Piaget emphasized that children aren't deficient adults needing to be filled with information. They're active constructors of knowledge, building understanding through direct interaction with the world. The stages aren't arbitrary age ranges. They're descriptions of genuinely different logical structures that must be built sequentially, because each stage creates the foundation for the next. You couldn't skip sensor motor and jump straight to formal operational any more than you could build the 10th floor of a building without constructing the floors beneath it. Each phase integrates and transcends what came before, maintaining its achievements while adding new capabilities. This realization should fundamentally change how you approach teaching anyone anything. Whether you're explaining a work process to a new employee, helping your child with homework, or trying to convince someone of a political position, recognizing their cognitive structure is more important than the elegance of your argument. The most brilliantly logical abstract reasoning will fail to persuade someone thinking concretely if you don't ground it in tangible examples they can directly engage with. Conversely, drowning someone in concrete examples without helping them extract the underlying pattern wastes the capabilities of a formal operational thinker. What's particularly humbling about Piaget's framework is recognizing how it applies to your own cognitive journey. Think back to beliefs you held with absolute certainty at different ages, convictions that felt completely rational at the time, but that you later abandoned, not because someone argued you out of them, but because your cognitive structure evolved to the point where they no longer made sense. That's not a failure of your earlier self. That's the natural progression of cognitive development. Your younger self wasn't stupid. They were thinking with the most sophisticated cognitive structures available to them at that developmental moment. You weren't ready to understand certain concepts, not because you weren't smart enough, but because the mental architecture to support that understanding hadn't been constructed yet. And here's the thing that should make you pause right now, in this present moment. If you've moved through these stages once, transforming your thinking fundamentally multiple times already, what makes you certain you're done developing? What if the thoughts you hold with absolute conviction right now, the perspectives that seem so obviously true, are constrained by cognitive structures that will themselves transform as you continue developing? Post-formal operational thinking, that 5th phase, includes the recognition that your current understanding is always provisional, always open to evolution. The wisest people aren't those with the most answers. They're those who recognize the limits of their current cognitive structures and remain open to transformation. Piaget spent his final years emphasizing that development isn't just about gaining capabilities. It's about integration. about maintaining the valuable elements of earlier phases while adding new powers. Formal operational thinking doesn't replace concrete operational thinking, it supplements it. You still need the ability to focus on tangible here and now reality that concrete operations provide. You still need the imaginative flexibility that pre-operational thinking offers. You still need the sensory grounding of sensoromotor intelligence. Development isn't a straight line upward where each stage is simply better than the last. It's a spiral where you gain new capabilities while hopefully maintaining access to earlier ways of engaging with reality. The practical applications of understanding these phases extend into virtually every domain of human activity. In education, recognizing that children move through predictable cognitive stages allows teachers to design developmentally appropriate curriculum that challenges students at the edge of their current capabilities, without overwhelming them with demands their cognitive structures can't yet support. In parenting, this knowledge transforms frustration into patience, helping parents recognize that certain behaviors aren't defiance or stupidity, but natural expressions of current cognitive limitations. In the workplace, managers who understand cognitive development can better match tasks to cognitive readiness, provide training that meets people where they actually are rather than where we wish they were, and create teams that leverage different cognitive styles rather than expecting everyone to think identically. In your personal relationships, this framework offers profound insight into why certain conversations repeatedly fail. When you and your partner keep having the same argument about planning for the future, there might be a cognitive structural difference where one of you naturally thinks in terms of long-term hypothetical scenarios, while the other focuses primarily on concrete immediate realities. Neither approach is wrong. They're different cognitive styles that need to be recognized and bridged rather than judged and dismissed. When your friend keeps giving you advice that focuses on specific actions, rather than engaging with the underlying pattern you're trying to identify, they're not being shallow. They're processing through concrete operations while you're seeking formal operational analysis. The tragedy is that most people move through their entire lives unaware of these developmental phases, both in themselves and others. They judge earlier phases as inferior rather than recognizing them as necessary foundations. They expect cognitive capabilities that haven't developed yet. They miss opportunities to support development by providing experiences at the right challenge level. They force premature abstract reasoning that creates confusion rather than clarity. They fail to recognize when they themselves are reverting to earlier cognitive structures under stress. This lack of awareness creates unnecessary suffering, frustration, and disconnection. But you right now, having traveled through this exploration of Piaget's life work, you have access to a framework that can transform every teaching interaction, every moment of confusion, every frustrated attempt at communication. You can recognize cognitive phases in real time. You can adjust your communication style to match someone's cognitive structure, rather than insisting they somehow leap to yours. You can appreciate your own developmental journey, recognizing that transformation is ongoing and natural. You can parent with patience grounded in understanding rather than frustration, rooted in unrealistic expectations. You can teach in ways that actually support cognitive growth, rather than demanding capabilities that don't exist yet. Jean Piaget's contribution wasn't just identifying these phases. It was demonstrating that intelligence is active construction, not passive reception. Knowledge isn't poured into minds like water into empty containers. It's built piece by piece through interaction with the world, through testing hypotheses, through encountering problems that stretch current capabilities just enough to force cognitive structures to adapt and grow. The best thing you can do for anyone's cognitive development, including your own, isn't to explain things more clearly. It's to create environments rich with opportunities for hands-on engagement with problems at the edge of current understanding, where assimilation meets accommodation and development happens naturally. This understanding should fill you with both humility and hope. Humility because it reveals that your current thinking, no matter how sophisticated, is still constrained by cognitive structures that will continue evolving if you remain engaged with challenging problems and perspectives. Hope because it demonstrates that cognitive development isn't fixed at some arbitrary point. Growth remains possible throughout life. The mind that can transform multiple times from birth through adolescence hasn't exhausted its capacity for transformation. You can continue developing more flexible, integrated dialectical ways of thinking for your entire lifetime if you remain actively engaged with the world in ways that challenge your current cognitive structures. If you're sitting here recognizing yourself in these phases, seeing your children or colleagues or past self in these descriptions, feeling both validated that the frustrations you've experienced make sense and excited about the possibilities this framework opens up, then I want to invite you to continue this journey of discovery with us. This channel is dedicated to exploring profound insights about human development, cognition, and potential, breaking down complex psychological frameworks into practical wisdom you can apply immediately in your real life. We dive deep into the work of pioneering thinkers who dedicated their lives to understanding what makes us human, translating their discoveries into tools you can use to understand yourself and others more fully. Every week, we explore another dimension of human psychology, another framework for making sense of behavior, development, and potential. If what we've covered today resonated with you, if you found yourself seeing people around you and your own journey in new ways, then join us for the next exploration. We're building a community of people committed to understanding human development at the deepest levels, people who recognize that true wisdom comes from grasping these fundamental patterns that shape how we think, learn, and grow. Hit that subscribe button and you'll be notified each time we release a new exploration into the architecture of human consciousness. And speaking of cognitive development, our next video explores another revolutionary discovery that connects directly to what we've covered today. We're diving into Lev Vygotsky's theory of the zone of proximal development, which explains exactly how to identify the perfect challenge level to support cognitive growth. That sweet spot where learning accelerates because it's neither too easy nor too difficult. Vygotsky's work perfectly complements Piaget's stages, showing how social interaction and cultural tools shape the journey through these cognitive phases. If understanding cognitive development matters to you, if you want to know how to actually support growth in yourself and others, rather than just describing the phases, that next video is essential viewing. You've just gained a framework that changes how you see every learning moment, every communication challenge, every developmental milestone. You understand now that minds don't just accumulate information, they transform through distinct phases, each with its own logic, its own capabilities, its own necessary place in the developmental journey. You recognize that frustration often arises from mismatched cognitive structures, not from failure or stupidity. You see that development is an active process of construction requiring engagement with appropriately challenging problems. And you know that this journey doesn't end in adolescence. Growth remains possible throughout life for those who continue actively engaging with the world in ways that stretch their current cognitive capabilities. This is knowledge that changes everything, and you've only just begun exploring what it makes possible.